Currently in our state, China manipulates its economy by doing one of two things. Firstly, they either continuously print the yuan to make sure that they artificially make deflation happen inside the economy, or secondly, the Central Bank of China manipulates its currency and makes the currency strength change. That is what they do, and in many nations invest in China because of that reason, because they see China as being a very cheap product, a cheap way as being cheap. But we think that when China is based on manufacturing and exporting, we think that it's important to recognize that it's necessary for China to do this in order to combat with the other factors that exist in our society. So I'm going to bring to you mainly two arguments. Firstly, it's going to be about the economic sovereignty of China, and then further I'm going to give you three main reasons why that's necessary. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why this is uniquely necessary to China, and I'm going to give you like 3 reasons to support that proposal. So firstly, economic sovereignty and why China has this right to do so. We need to recognize that, as a principle, China is a state which owes responsibility firstly towards its citizens, then towards the international community. The reason is simply because the people vote for them, the people pay taxes, and that there is the simple government argument. And because of that, is a principle that exists, a common principle across the board, which every single nation in our society accepts towards. We think that's something we need to recognize, and that's the reason why we have in our society, in other nations as well, immigration laws and so on, which prioritizes your own nation first, your own people first, and then the international community. We believe that there is an economic sovereignty that exists as well. Firstly, we believe that there is a right to self-defense in economic terms to protect your own economy. We think that harms by the recession can be seen as tantamount to damages done through war and so on. We need to see examples such as Greece. 1 out of 4 people there are unemployed. The industry is all wiped out. There are people on the streets rioting, falling out. It's clear mayhem. We think that that's in the same way tantamount to what would happen if that country had gone to war. We think there's not too much comparative there. We need to recognize the fact that economic flexibility is necessary to defend itself from these happening. We think that in the same way that we allow self-defense to happen for the military, we allow them to buy as many planes as they want when they need to, then we allow them to buy as little when they need to. We think it's the same principle that applies, but only in economic terms. I think that's the same principle that we should stand by. We need to secondly recognize the fact that these are countermeasures to other nations that exist inside our society. For example, India has a very protectionist society, protectionist way of doing their economy. They just allow Walmart to go in to their nation because they see that as being damaging to their own economy. They have this kind of protectionist measure. The reason is the Indian people feel that national attachment, that loyalty to their own products, which isn't the same thing that can be said for the Chinese people and the Chinese product. Secondly, we need to recognize the fact that the EU and the United States, they continue to subsidize agriculture, they continue to bail out big companies, big banks when they were about to fail, or the automobile companies. These are things that EU nations, the United States, continuously go about doing. I think that the way that China is doing this is the manipulation of the yuan. We think it's absolutely the same thing that they're doing, only in a different way, but the reasoning of doing so is the same, and we think that's something we need to recognize. So secondly, we need to recognize the economic necessity of taking this proposal and why this is so necessary for China in the first place. China is a very industrialized heavy nation, and most of its income is contingent on its exporting capabilities. They need to have a strong ability to export its products out in society in order for them to stay strong as a big economy, so that they don't lose out to like EU and United States. When the export power really decreases, the problem with China is that they don't have a ready-made safety net on the other hand, such as in the same way that exists in the EU or United States. The EU and the United States also have a fairly strong service-based industry as well, something that does not exist in China. I think that's a clear comparison that we need to recognize inside this debate. So when that happens, when the export power of, say, EU nations or United States go down, they still can rely on their service-based industry and keep their economy strong. China, however, their service-based industry is not as strong, it's not to the same extent strong, it's still in its infant state. And that's the exact reason why Xi Jinping, when he got into power, said they need to protect their own economy. This is the exact same reason. We need to recognize the fact that this is a countermeasure of China to its economic vulnerability. We think that China has no other alternatives to turn to, as of now, in today's state, in order to continue to have its strong economy. And when we see a clear case where, say, one day if the United States decide to simply extract all their companies from China, then China's industry and its economy falls down because they have no other way to turn to. I think in that instance, we need to recognize that they are being held as a hostage in a way, and therefore we need to recognize that they should have and they need to have their right to manipulate the yuan, the economy, to make sure that they get that economic advantage in the first place. Yeah.
You mentioned that this is self-defense. Who is the aggressor against China and what is the existential threat that exists? Because otherwise we believe that China is the one that's being aggressive.
What we told you and what I have been telling you is the threat of the dollar, the threat of the euros, and we're saying that that's far superior to China's yuan right now. We think that that's something we need to recognize, and when that's the context of this debate, without having this policy, China's yuan cannot thrive in our society. So secondly, we need to recognize why it's important to protect industry-based, why protecting is important for industry-based nations. In the 1930s, EU and the United States did exactly the same thing. Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deals in the 1930s, it was to create a deflational dollar. But that's the same thing that we're doing this. That's the same thing that China's doing this. The reason is exactly the same in these instances. Because it's an export economy right now, in order to move on to an export plus a service-based economy, this is a process that is necessary to go through. Secondly, or thirdly, we need to recognize the fact that China needs to combat the historical currency domination of the US and the EU. The yuan is relatively new compared to the other two mentioned, and they are starting at a disadvantage in the first place because the EU and the US are more trustworthy and they're more likely to get money than income. China can't win this battle of purchasing power, of currency, and therefore the only way China can win is based on its exports. We think in that instance, it's a fair thing to do. So we believe that from our side of the house, in order to preserve the economy of China and its strength, we're happy to support this motion. Thank you.
Strongly believe that as China becomes a larger, more dominant player in the world, there exists a need to become more fair, more responsible, to have a more internationalized currency that provides a platform for globalized transaction while ensuring the next leg of China's growth is secure. If some harms do come along the way, we are willing to bite the bullet. We are willing to bite the bullet and suck it up because we believe that where the positive effects that come from having a more internationalized and market-dependent currency far outweigh the harms. Now, before I move on to my three main points of argumentation, I want to set up some ground as to and characterize the situation as what happened. Right? The government has already come here and spoken to you about how it's important. It has been historically important for China to keep the currency undervalued for exporting purposes, while they were a developing, underdeveloped country, and that was the only way in which they could be competitive in the real world. Right? However, this is not largely true today. We are comfortable with all countries keeping a minor buffer to ensure that if somebody is attacking their currency, etc., they have some measures to stop it from happening, right? Like temporary pause on trading, like having a minimum buffer so that the government doesn't become completely illiquid and can't settle its debts in foreign currencies, etc. But China here is the aggressor because the scale at which they do this, keeping the currency 40 to 60% completely devalued on one level. At a second level, Chinese yuan cannot be traded like currencies such as the US dollar or the Singapore dollar or the Malaysian ringgit. Because there's so many controls onto the Chinese yuan, right? Nobody in the world can actually touch their currency, right? So this is another kind of control that China imposes on people. When we see these kind of controls being imposed, we are bound to believe that China is actually the aggressor in international economics, and it's not the sad plight of self-defense that this side of the house would like you to believe, right? At the second level, they came up here and argued about why, you know what, everybody else is doing it anyway, right? The US does it for agriculture, and somebody else does it for another particular industry, right? And somebody else does it for something else. But the difference over here lies is that when you do it with your currency and not with a particular industry, you're basically doing it for all industries in your service sector. So what the Chinese people are doing is far more insidious than what the other countries are doing to protect one particular industry at a particular point in time. The Chinese are doing it throughout, and we believe there is value in having fair international competition in which the governments don't intervene, but the people, because of their own ingenuity and economic prowess, actually compete, and we don't think the government should help in certain things like that, right? So we believe that it doesn't make it legitimate just because everyone else is doing it, and secondly, we believe the scale at which China is doing it makes it illegitimate. Next, we come to our policy where we say that even if minor harms that they claim to see in the Chinese currency do exist, we believe because three reasons why this is extremely important. We believe to become more internationalized and have a more powerful currency, you need to take the risk of making your currency more market dependent. Why is this more important? We believe that as China, where 15% of the world's money supply lies, because it's the largest trader in the world, is the second biggest economy in the world, about to take the US in the next few years' time is concerned, we believe it's important for them to have all transactions denominated in their own currency so the people in China are shielded from currency risks. What does this basically mean? This basically means that if I am a small and medium enterprise and if I export to consumers abroad, right, which is a typical Chinese businessman, which is the majority in China, which is somebody who you're more likely to support in a situation like this, you have to denominate everything in the US dollar. The reason you have to denominate everything in the US dollar is because the Chinese government doesn't allow you to denominate those things in the yuan when you're trading with people abroad. What happens when something like this happens is that you always keep a markup 5 to 10% in excess of your cost price to make up for the fact that currencies might switch, and because of currency exchange rate switching, your cost could actually become more expensive than you actually preemptively think about it. When these transactions become denominated in the Chinese yuan, the people in China don't care about currency manipulation, and cost prices actually come down, and more people trade in the Chinese yuan. Now this is from the perspective of a small and medium enterprise. But when we look at global transactions for huge commodities like oil and gas, like agricultural commodities, which are at a much larger scale, we believe that things in China for Chinese people are going to get a lot cheaper. And we believe by having more transactions denominated into the Chinese yuan, so Chinese yuan becomes a much more powerful currency, right? Because everything so far has been denominated in the US dollar. Then the Euro people, they got together, built a common currency, so they could also become powerful and they could have transactions denominated in their currency. We believe that the only way for China to get to the level of the euro or the US dollar is to actually internationalize their currency in this way. Before I move on to my next point, are there any POIs?
So you said that it's wrong if you do it across the board. How about stimulus packages in the United States designed to make sure that their exports are cheaper?
Alright, this is where I come to my second point, right? The stimulus packages that you are talking about in the United States are firstly momentarily in time. It's not across the board for all the time anyway, right? So it's still more insidious in the Chinese yuan in the first place. At the second place, we talk about what is the fair and more responsible thing to do for a large country like China, and more responsible for the world, which is where I'm going to tackle with your point as well, where we see that the US government does not only do things for its own benefit, but actually when there's international pressure for the US to maintain quantitative easing, to maintain deflation in the economy over a long run, which may not be useful for them, to maintain a higher inflation in the economy over a long run by quantitative easing, they bow down to international pressure because they know what is good for the world economy and for the world markets. They do the right thing, the more responsible thing. So we believe that China should, at this stage should also do things like that. In the 1970s and 80s, when Japan was like the China of that time, right? The manufacturing unit of the world, the factory of the world, etc. We believe that Japan also depreciated their currency. But after a certain amount of development and taking responsibility in the world, we believe that it's right for the country to take responsibility and stop playing cheap and doing competition over these grounds, right? We believe that it's time for the country to actually ensure that their practices are fair and they're doing what is actually correct, right? Because whatever they do has spillover effects on other developing countries and other factories of the world. At a third level, we strongly believe that there's no need in China to actually devalue your currency anymore. China's next leg of economic growth is going to come from consumerism and services. Chinese people currently save too much and export too much. They do not consume enough at home. When the EU and the US are actually dragging the world markets down, we don't think the sky is the limit to keep exporting your products. We believe that more inclusive growth, which is what the next 5 or next 10 years of Chinese economic policy is anyway, where you actually want to import more goods from abroad, where you actually want to make sure that the citizens consume more goods so the economy is less lopsided. lopsided. In this side of the situation, we don't even think there is a need for keeping the currency so depreciated. In fact, if anything, there's harm because you can't import enough. For all of these reasons, we are very, very proud.
At one point in time, at times it is necessary to make hard economic calls, i.e. by the implementation of stimulus packages in order to deflate the economy at that point in time, because it was necessary. That's the exact thing which FDR did when he implemented New Deal 1 and New Deal 2 in 1930s, right after the global recession at that point in time. China is facing that exact threat now. We recognize that this might not necessarily be permanent and perpetual, in just the same way when New Deal 1 and New Deal 2 stopped in 1945. But we think in this particular juncture, we have reached an economic juncture which requires China to do so in order for China to stay afloat. And they did concede to that because we need to recognize one thing. This was the argument which they made. Because they wanted China to reach a service-based industry and for China to become, to make yuan international currency. But for that to happen, China needs to transition from a manufacturing-based industry to a more balanced-based industry, which is manufacturing and also service-based industry. In just the same way how Japan did it and the United States did it through the stimulus packages which exist in the past. Three arguments will be discussed in my speech. Firstly, the principle of reciprocity. What I'll show you, ladies and gentlemen, is how China has assisted EU, United States, and ASEAN and African countries in the past. Therefore, they owe responsibility to allow China to do this. Secondly, if we don't allow China to do this, what will be the global ripple effect which will exist? And finally, the discussion upon how do we stop the impending subprime mortgage crisis which is happening in China. Before that, 4 questions must be answered. The first one is the assertion that China needs to create an international currency. But how do we create an international currency? This is something which I missed. An international currency can only be created if China transitions from an unstable economy to a stable economy. But the only way for that to happen is for China to not base its economy only on manufacturing base. That's why EU and United States only became the 2 strongest currency providers in 1960s when they transitioned through that path, ladies and gentlemen. But we need to recognize one thing. China must pick its battle. Under status quo, and this is what UK told you, the USD and EU are already very strong when it comes to currency wars, and when it comes to the strength of the currency. Therefore, the smart thing for China to do is not to concentrate on that path, but to concentrate on the path on manufacturing and to move on towards other transitions in the future to insulate its economy. So we think that's the better path for us to take. The second question which I need to answer, is China the aggressor? They say China is the aggressor because China continuously deflates its economy. There are 3 reasons why China must deflate its economy. The first reason, ladies and gentlemen, as UK told you, is because China is manufacturing heavy. We need to recognize one thing. Western companies are also complicit in this act because Western companies are the biggest providers of Chinese industries of that. Like Dell, Apple, all move these industries to China. Therefore, they are the reasons why China are dependent on them, ladies and gentlemen. So we think in this way, China is currently being held as economic hostages towards those industries itself. So we think it is necessary for China to be able to counter back by deflating and inflating yuan whenever it deems it to be necessary. The second reason, ladies and gentlemen, because the continuous influx of Western companies have in a way directly increased the standard of labor of Chinese workers. That means Chinese workers now are demanding for higher wages and higher pays. That's why it is important for China to combat increase by deflating the yuan. Because if China doesn't do this, automatically other countries and companies will move towards countries like India, where the standard of labor is significantly lower and cheaper. That's why it's necessary as well. The third reason, ladies and gentlemen, this is the biggest reason, the most obvious reason. The reason why China must do this is because China must defend itself from all the mistakes which were committed by EU and United States. Because of the subprime mortgage crisis within the United States, and because of the Eurozone crisis which happened, ladies and gentlemen, the export abilities of China have significantly reduced because they can't export as much to its EU and US. Therefore, it needs to defend itself to ensure that it has a sustainable consumer base, Mr. Speaker. And for that to happen, we think that continuous deflation of the yuan is something which is justified to balance the harms which were created by your mistakes. The third question, does fair competition exist? And they did agree to a stimulus packages, but they just say it's temporary. If that's the case, then under our policy, that's the same way as well. China can choose to do this whenever it seems to be necessary, but we think it must exist nonetheless. But that side did agree, right? He did agree. Because on the one hand, they say fair competition is important, guys. And then they say, oh, never mind, stimulus packages can exist. Chill, protectionist policies can exist. That means in a way you have already contradicted yourself. The final argument we should discuss is that we want consumerism in China to be really strong. We agree, but we think consumerism will be more sustainable under our policy. Because if we deflate the yuan, now there's a disincentive for Chinese investors to move out to other countries because the yuan is far cheaper and the cost of investment in China is far cheaper. I.e., as a tourist, it's better for you to stay in China in contrast for you to move out because the cost of you to purchase like a hotel or anything else in China will be significantly cheaper. Therefore, the circulation of money in China will be much higher in our policy because there's a disincentive for them to go to countries like US and other countries which have very high rate when it comes to currency. Before I move on, yes.
So if you agree that consumerism is going to be the next step and is going to be important, we believe that having a depreciated currency is going to harm imports into the currency, and people of China won't be able to consume things. They will have to pay a much higher price for imports.
I just told you, right? Because the reason why like these Chinese investors will not choose to go out because the cost of investing in China is significantly cheaper than the cost of investing otherwise, right? But we think the transition must happen, and the transition can only happen under our policy. Now let's move on to its reciprocity. The first reason, ladies and gentlemen, we need to recognize that China has saved EU during the Eurozone crisis because China is the only country which has chosen to purchase the toxic debt which were created by EU nations, ladies and gentlemen, which have in a way stabilized some European countries like Spain. Maybe not Portugal, but Spain. The second reason, China, when you look at the United States, China has more than $1 trillion USD in United States Federal Reserve. What has that created? That means now United States credit rating has been stable just after the subprime mortgage crisis. At the same time, because of that, USD is now a stable currency. If China hadn't done that, ladies and gentlemen, it had been an unstable currency to a point it will affect every one of us in this room because we are dependent on USD. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we have a moral responsibility to repatriate back. The final reason, because China has continuously given development aid, unconditional development aid, to its Asian nations and also in Africa. That's why we think there's a responsibility to do that as well. On the ripple effect, ladies and gentlemen, we need to recognize one thing. If China fails, the ripple effect will be massive because a lot of Western companies are based in China, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, at least China will be forced to retract its foreign reserve within the USD itself. That means will lead towards the destruction of the global economy. Where have we reached so far? That side agree that at times it is necessary to deflate and inflate the currency. But they just say, we just want it to be temporary. We don't want it to be temporary. They want it to be temporary, just not permanent. That's exactly what we want. We have reached this juncture and we need to do this now.
Two main points of discussion in this debate. Firstly, why China no longer needs this sort of currency manipulation. They directly clashes with their idea of why stimulus packages are okay sometimes versus using it as the basis of driving your economy as a comparative advantage. And secondly, how it creates a dangerous precedent in the global financial system and why we think that counters all these ideas of because China does some good, we should allow them to get away with these little things. We don't think that that's the case. But before that, several areas of the country. So the core of our policy coming right from first people was that we are okay with having a small reserve in case of extreme economic fluctuation. And when they gave the example of the New Deal, right, in response to the Great Depression, it was the worst economic crisis the world had ever seen. And it was specifically in response to that sort of existential threat that they had those sort of policies. But we said that for China, right, it's been the basis of their economic rise right for the past 2 decades, right. There was no existential threat to the people there on the scale or magnitude that they would have you believe, right. And so we think that it was while it was okay to the extent where it was in the basis of the economic rise, we think it was okay then because it didn't have the harms that it has now. And I'll explain that in my extension. The basic idea that stimulus packages don't have the same sort of spillover harms that we're talking about, because we don't think it's analogous. Secondly, this idea about consumerism in China, right? So we took already POI them telling you that if the yuan is devalued, extremely devalued, we feel that first people are going to have to pay a lot more for import coming in because your own currency is a lot bigger, which is the basis of driving that export-driven growth. So this sort of consumerism in China isn't necessarily increased as a result of that. But secondly, it doesn't encourage the sort of investment that they're talking about. And moreover, even if we consider say that that investment may be better, we say that it happens exclusively within the manufacturing sector. Why is that? Because this is a clear contention, right? Can this focus on manufacturing lead us to a service-based economy? We told you clearly no, and there are two main reasons for this. Because they compete for the same factors of production, because manufacturing industries are extremely capital intensive and power hungry, especially the companies in China, which is why the sort of, and they have a track record for being successful, because the entire basis of the Chinese economy and the currency in which they trade is a cheap currency that supports manufacturing that can be sold cheaply abroad. You can't do the same thing for services. You can't sell them at those sort of subsidized rates, which is why this magical transaction that happens at some period of time doesn't, because the structural features that exist within the economy support a manufacturing-based industry, but it doesn't bleed into supporting a service-based industry, which is the clear difference between a strong US currency and the devalued yuan. So we don't understand how this transaction happens in the very first place, which is why we told you that you need a more market-dependent currency, right? Because we also extract how it's always safer to trade in your own currency, which is why we want to encourage you to have that market-dependent currency so that your own domestic industries can trade within the yuan. You don't have to have the necessary markup to hedge against fluctuation in international trade when you're trading in the US dollar, because that's the most, because the most is the currency that fluctuates the most with the market instead of being artificially controlled by the Chinese government, right? And lastly, this idea, because which came out from the first speaker, right? Because India does it, it's okay, right? We tell that if you look at the Chinese companies like Huawei, which is the world's largest telecom, and you compare it with the examples that you gave, or examples in India where small companies like Flipkart are unable to compete with giants like Amazon, the rationale is that you want to protect smaller industries that will necessarily be wiped out. But when your own companies are the market leader and the largest companies in the world, we don't think that that same rationale exists in the very first place. It might exist for SMEs, but I've already told you how it hurts them, because they have to conduct their transactions now in the US dollar, and they have to have that markup, making their own goods more expensive. So we don't think any of these benefits necessarily will be invested outside. So why does China no longer need this currency manipulation, right? We said, why, like other developing countries, to a limited extent, you did have certain amounts of currency manipulation. What is the main reason for that? Because while you were still developing and you were importing key goods that were required for your development, like fuel and the like, when you subsidize those for your domestic industries, you necessarily need to reservice that debt. And one of the biggest ways in which governments, or especially developing countries, used to reservice their debt was to a limited extent to manipulate their currency, so the cost of it wouldn't be so extreme. We say that when you look at China now as the world's largest creditor, the incremental benefit that comes about of this policy no longer exists. It may have existed 2 or 3 decades ago, but the state of development that China has reached means that the benefits of this policy are no longer going to lead it to the next phase of its growth, which is what Vikram told you about, securing the growth in the next phase. Sit down, sorry. So what is the problem there? Is that it hurts weaker economies, and how does it do this, right? Firstly, because prices in China are artificially low. So manufacturing-based economies in the region, like Cambodia, Myanmar, and the like, which compete on the same basic products like shoes or electronics and the like, aren't able to keep up because of the artificially low prices that Chinese companies are able to have. It hurts the sort of economic development within the region, which counters the sort of, they give generous aid to Africa, yes, because they don't compete in the same market as these sort of African nations, which is why it's okay to give them aid. But before I move on to the second point about how it creates a dangerous precedent in the international financial system.
How can China create a stable currency when its main economic engine, which is the export industry, is being crippled because now they're dependent on it?
We think they can, because we think they can, because firstly the sheer scale of the export market that exists in China means that you're the world's largest trader firstly. We don't understand why you're necessarily going to be crippled as a result of this. You might make less profit, but you're not going to spin off into a recession within China. Your prices might become more expensive, but you never explain necessarily why they're going to become so artificially higher or uncompetitive to the point that no one is going to buy Chinese goods. Because that's the assumption that you have to buy for you to say that China is just going to implode and no one's going to buy it anymore. That's not how it's going to work. So why does it create a dangerous precedent in the global financial system? We'll say that now countries like the US and Japan may retaliate, as they threatened to do so before with similar measures. Why is this bad? There are two main problems. Firstly, because it hurts things like safe haven currencies like Swiss franc and the like, because if all the other currencies around you become cheaper, like the Chinese yuan, like the US dollar, like the Japanese yen, then your holdings in currencies like the Swiss franc suddenly become increasingly expensive. It becomes increasingly expensive to invest in these sort of currencies, which hurts all the holdings that exist within these currencies. Secondly, people within the countries like the US now, who see their currency being artificially manipulated downward to compete with China, see the value of things like their pensions and savings all going down systematically. So we see that it essentially leads to a global race to the bottom, where everyone is trying to counter this sort of insidious behavior. But secondly, it creates a potential bubble in many of these economies, because you see capital flight towards industries like property and the like. When the US dollar becomes extremely devaluated, you try and push your investment out of the US dollar and into key assets like gold and the like, which happened in the real estate crisis within the US. The problem of that is when you create this artificial capital flight towards an industry, you create a sort of bubble which, when it bursts, wipes out the sort of investment and puts you into that same existential threat that you wanted to talk about. It puts you into a downward economic spiral, and the reason for that is that because you have these sort of retaliatory measures, people in the short run try to safeguard their investment, but they do it in a way that's unsustainable in the long run. For all these reasons, we're not proposed.
We didn't necessarily win, they lost. Because when the LO came up and said it was okay for the United States to offer stimulus packages, because manipulation is sometimes necessary, manipulation of your currency is sometimes necessary for economic advantage. That's exactly what the motion is. Assuming that an economic advantage exists, are you willing to allow countries to manipulate their currency? They lost the debate right there and then. Regardless, let's assume they never said that. Let's look at this debate, right? Three issues. First of all, should a country have complete economic sovereignty? Second, countervailing measures and responsibility, are they necessary? Third, what's best in terms of transitioning China into an advanced form of economy? So first, ladies and gentlemen, because they never really responded to the crux of this debate, which we said from the very beginning is this, that economic sovereignty is this, that a country and a government will always have the first responsibility towards its own people. It's a shared viewpoint across all nations. This is why we allow countries to have draconian immigration policies, declining people of jobs from developing nations simply because it might or might not benefit some of their citizens. This is a shared viewpoint in all nations. This means that a country, does not matter what harm you talk about of other nations, a government will always have the first responsibility towards its own citizens. And therefore, if it deems that it's better for its own people, it must therefore have the right to manipulate the yuan. Again, that's where we already won. But let's still, look at these issues. Let's look at the issue of countervailing measures and whatnot, right? Because they say, first of all, we are opposed to continuous measures as opposed to temporary ones. Well, countries like China, countries like India have continuously used protectionist policies to protect their auto industry, to protect the agricultural industry, to protect all kinds, to protect even like multinational corporations from coming in and owning more than 49% of companies. This is why we see that other countries already have these policies, and therefore it is necessary for you to be able to countervail those measures. And this is something that we see already happening, right? They say, this will create a race to the bottom. A race to the bottom was created by other people. This is why China needs to react in the first place. But secondly, we don't think it will create a race to the bottom, because other countries will not devalue the yuan, because other countries have different incentives to react to. For instance, the United States, if it devalues the dollar too much, it might bring inflation within its country. So we don't think necessarily this is going to lead to everyone devaluing their currency, right? Second, they will talk about, they will also told you, then say, across the board policies are harmful. We told you across the board policies occur all the time as well. And this is exactly what the United States did even recently when Obama went through his stimulus package to make sure that exports occurred within the United States. We see that this also happened when the United States itself transitioned from an export-based economy to a consumerist economy when Roosevelt decided that he would have stimulus packages in order to make sure that investment was created within the economy. We say these things happen all the time, and China should not be branded as being unfair because it's doing exactly the same thing that other countries did. But then necessity, right? They never really tackled this idea. They said, transition is necessary. But what's right now is China. China is right now an export-based economy. And especially considering the United States and Eurozone brought about a crisis as a result of which Chinese exports have suffered. This is why it's absolutely necessary for China, in order to be able to remain competitive, for them to devalue the yuan, in order to make sure that the economy is stable enough for a transition to occur in the first place. But also because it is dependent on exports, therefore it must be able to devalue its yuan, especially considering that other countries are stopping a lot of their imports because they can't buy a lot of the stuff because of the recession. But secondly, they never really rebutted this idea, right? They only said, oh, China has been there for a long time. So what? The yuan is still considered a less stable currency than the US dollar or the euro. This is why slightly cheaper still doesn't work for China. It must have a lot cheaper products in order to sell in the international market. This is why we see it's fair for them to do so, because the United States and the eurozone have an advantage over them. Like when Germany exports its auto industries, everyone wants to buy Germany's products because they think the euro is much more stable currency. This is why in order to be able to compete, it must be substantially lower than euro or the dollar. Ladies and gentlemen, then they said, oh wait, it hurts developing nations. First of all, we told you, so what, right? Because the responsibility is towards the citizens first. But second, we already told you this, right? That countries like Africa, countries in Africa, in Asia, are in the first place, are existent in the global economy, are existent in the export industry. Because China chose to unconditionally build roads for them, for their companies to be able to transport to the airport. They build airports for them, they subsidize industries for them to be created in the first place, so that they can even exist within this industry. We think it's just fair that China has the ability to compete with them right now. We also told you the United States itself, like with only a 1% interest rate, the Chinese government decides that $1 trillion reserve is created for the United States economy. This means it has the power to simply cripple the world economy and the United States, but it doesn't. In exchange for keeping the US economy stable, the least it can offer is competitive advantage. Similarly with euro, right? It has continuously bought yields, it has continuously traded with eurozone, in spite of the fact that other countries wanted to pull out during the eurozone crisis. We feel it's only fair that you repay them for their parts in helping you keep stable.
Your assertion is that China uses this policy in response to the 2008 recession created by the US and the EU. Can you please explain why they used such policies even prior to that, when there wasn't this sort of threat that hurts their exports?
I think you gave the justification before when you said at that point in time they needed to be able to export because they weren't developed enough. So I don't get it. Like, okay, so transitioning, right? Because then you said necessary to, because what we want to understand is that they said, oh, how does it help transition? And it makes imports expensive. Okay, first of all, the response to that is this. China doesn't really import much. The level of exports it does, it will be easily able to subsidize the imports that it does, right? Even if it makes it expensive. Second, because exports means that a lot more money comes into the country, even if it makes things more expensive, people will have that purchasing power to buy those products. Third issue, right? Because then they never really understood this. The transitioning is helped by our process. Because when central banks keep rates low, this means people are encouraged to invest. And therefore that transitioning is occurring best under our model when people do have the ability to invest and a lot of small and medium enterprises are created. This means the transitioning that you're talking about, the consumer's world that you want, is created because a lot of people are willing to invest in a country where the rates are low, kept low by the central bank. This means that people can transition. A lot more investment occurs within the economy and people's purchasing power also increases. What have you shown you here today? You've shown you here that, look, we must play fair. If all other nations do it, why can't China? If they must have the first responsibility towards its own people, but they've also helped other nations in the process, why can't we simply repay them back? The motion stands.
I'm going to pierce this illusion that China is an angel. Secondly, I'm going to question whether or not rights exist in the vacuum of public responsibilities. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about which is the best way forward. Firstly, we say that in the global economic arena, every country plays by certain rules. We say yes, it is true that stimulus packages are required when your country is in recession. But the difference with China is that it has systematically, across the past few decades, kept its currency artificially low in a way in which no other country has, to the extent that it's undervalued by 40 to 60%. we don't think then that they can justify it to be the same as the America's New Deal, which was essentially an emergency measure to bring the economy out of the doldrums it was in. But if we look at China, it's now the largest economy in the world. It grows at the fastest rate across the world despite the economic recession, which hurts everybody. Its companies such as Huawei are becoming the world leaders in technology as well as in size. So we don't understand the justification that they've given us, right? But more importantly, what did they say? Oh, but you know they buy your toxic debt. But we say what China is really doing is akin to being a loan shark. Why is it that the first world has debt in the first place? Why is it that they suffer a budget deficit in the first place? It is caused by China's artificially cheap goods which were dumped offshore in their economy, right? And at the end of the day, this debt which China undertakes still has to be paid back to them. We say this situation is analogous to a loan shark at a gambling den where the odds are manipulated in favor of the house, and then after that, money is lent to you so that you can continue to gamble and spend more and be in greater debt in the future. But secondly, the second response they had was, oh, but Africa and Asia benefit from a lot of China's money. But hey, Chinese firms are paid quite a large amount of profit when they build roads and infrastructure in Africa. These roads and infrastructure are used to extract natural resources to exploit these countries in Africa. Huawei became the greatest telecoms one of the greatest telecoms company in the world because it operates within Africa. So don't try and tell me that China is trying to be altruistic. At the end of the day, all these measures benefit them the most. But secondly, let's talk about whether or not rights exist in a vacuum. And here's where we explain to you that China exists in an international order where your actions affect others due to the existence of trade-offs. They themselves concede this principle to a certain extent when they realize that trade-offs exist, which is why they say that China needs to defend themselves against trade-offs. But what we put forth then is that China is the greatest aggressor. Right? We recognize that there's sovereignty and positive duty, we recognize sovereignty and that countries have positive duties to their own citizens, but they also have negative duties not to hurt others and to exist in peace in a peaceful and harmonious way with the rest of the world. That's why we think it's necessary for them to play fair based on certain limits. Unlike the current situation where there's unfair economic advantage. We see that as it is, the size of China's economy, the fact that the greatest importer and exporter of goods, China is now the world's factory, but also the world's market and its greatest trading power. This is why manipulation of their currency disproportionately makes its goods much cheaper to the world and its imports far more expensive to its own citizens in a way which no other country can achieve the exact same effect. What they're essentially doing then is exploiting their own size to bully smaller economies, to build it at the basis of their own economic advantage. Right? So let's move on to the next idea. Is this self-defense? We think like this idea of sovereignty and self-defense actually works for us because we believe China to be the greatest aggressor in this debate, to be an existential threat to all other countries because companies are the most successful and the highest growth rates all over the world. Well, unlike China, however, smaller countries such as Cambodia and Myanmar, which are just starting to industrialize and just starting to move into manufacturing, suffer from greater economic disadvantages because they're underdeveloped, they're uncompetitive, they're small and vulnerable to global fluctuations, just like China was 30, 40 years ago. But the problem now is that services are already 40% of China's economy. I quote this verbatim from The Economist 2 weeks ago, and they should be trying to move up the value chain, but they obstinately cling on to the basic manufacturing services without giving other countries a chance to grow in the same way they have. We say this is an assault upon all other economies of the world, and it makes the transition up the value chain for themselves much harder. Because at the end of the day, depreciation of the economy makes imports of basic goods more expensive, and it suppresses Chinese people's own disposable income to then spend on the service sector. So what's the way forward? We think that essentially, let's compare the two stances. They say China has to keep prices low so that it becomes an attractive place to invest, so that SMEs will benefit. But we explain to you that the strict capital controls in China means that their great transaction costs. But also at the same time, you need to recognize that the only reason why the US is able to be the reserve currency of the world is because China refuses to allow the world to trade in yuan. So I don't understand why they're blaming that on the United States. But so long as China's own currency is weak, right, and is subject to exchange, like and people can't trade on the international markets based on yuan, small and medium companies will incur exchange rate costs and fluctuations. That's why they have no choice but to mark up their prices to hedge against the risk of the exchange rates and as well as the depreciating companies, which makes them less competitive than the larger companies within China. We see that, like, at the end of the day, this also hurts the service industries because, let's face it, services are not something they can sell cheaply to the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, the cheap labor which exists within China doesn't aid the industry in any way if people don't have enough disposable income to spend on those domestic service industries. At the end of the day, we explained to you, right? Yes, the only thing that this is going to lead to in the long run is a race to the bottom. And we think this race to the bottom is something which China has started, has exacerbated over the past 30 or 40 years. It's also hurting countries such as the Swiss with their Swiss francs going through the roof, with Japan and their economic crisis. It creates bubbles in economies because people hedge against risk by spending on things like property and stocks, which creates bubbles in the long run, makes the world economy a much more variable and fluctuating one. For all these reasons, we can.
Thanks. Very last speaker up there. Reply to Because I'm going to come here and give you 10 reasons as to why we should win this debate. Right? At the very first, we believe that we told you about how having transactions denominated in your own currency makes your currency more powerful and more legitimate in the world, right? We've shown you how the US dollar is already doing it. The European Union has come together and tried to do it, and we believe that China has a fighting chance given its size and economy, and they want to do it as well. And this can only happen when people start transacting in your currency and it starts behaving along with the market, and it's not strictly controlled by the government. We have absolutely no response from this side of the house with regards to this issue. At a second level, we showed you how if China reduces their currency, then Cambodia will do it, and Japan will do it, and the US will do it, and all other countries are going to have a currency warfare. Now, this kind of a currency warfare is firstly, they only came up and said, oh, US might not do it because it might increase their inflation and stuff. But we believe that that's not going to happen, right? When everybody is removing the currency rock bottom low, everybody is going to try to depreciate their currency. There was no analysis from their side as to how you could stop the race to the bottom and how that will be a bad thing to the world. Thirdly, why is it specifically a bad thing to the world? We spoke to you about how asset prices are going to become extremely volatile. People rush towards things such as gold, towards property, towards things that poor common people don't have access to and cannot invest inside, right? So we basically see that these prices are going to suddenly become very, very expensive, whereas other things such as things in China, etc., will become very, very low. In these volatility, we've shown you how it's the poor people, the common people who are hurt the most, who don't have any hedges against this kind of volatility. The sufferers of the 2008 crisis were US homeowners, etc., who couldn't stomach the volatility. At a fourth level, we spoke to you about how the people who have cash-denominated assets during currency warfare are the ones who are hurt the most. Your grandmothers and grandfathers who had the money stashed out in pension account, who had 1,000 yuan yesterday, but today that 1,000 yuan is only worth 500 yuan because you know what? You just go on depreciating in currency wars. Okay. Fifthly, we spoke to you about how both sides of the house agree that China needs to transition from a manufacturing export-based economy to a consumption and service-based economy. We've spoken to you about how the atmosphere that exists right now is tailored to an export-based economy. While they're saying they need to shift to a consumption-based economy, they don't show us how. They don't solve the problem. All they say is that, exports are important anyway. This side of the House concedes that exports are important, and that is the bulk of China's thing. But if you want to move from one to another, the government has to start the policy first. The government has to ensure that there is a market where people can import goods, where people can find imported goods in the supermarket, buy imported cars. But they said that, you know what, Chinese people don't do it anyway. But that's very chicken and egg. The Chinese people cannot do it because these things are too expensive. When these products come and come to the Chinese market, they're denominated in a much more devalued currency, which is why people cannot afford it. Fifthly, we spoke about how protectionism as a reserve or backup policy is what should be carried forward, not as a prime focus of your policy. We believe it's anti-competitive, and they think that just because 2008 recession, oh poor thing, China is still suffering, so they need to basically do all these things. We don't think we're showing double-digit growth, they're prospering. We don't think it's an emergency situation anymore. Right? Seventhly, we spoke about how developing countries and why China needs to compete with them because China let them develop first. Well, China is extracting resources from them. China is not going around building factories in them. China is not going around giving them jobs, right? So we don't see how that point particularly implies and how those countries are becoming competitors to China or benefiting from China's depreciation of policy, right? We basically spoke about how fair competition is extremely important, right? They never spoke to us about why we shouldn't fairly compete. All they said was, you know what, everybody does it anyway, so we might as well do it, right? 9, we basically spoke about how it's important for China to show greater responsibility and magnanimity in the world in a way where it's becoming a larger and more responsible country. No responses from them even on that side. 10, hey, we gave you like 9 reasons and proved all of them. So we believe that it's fairly legitimate. We take this really. Thank you.
Thanks for your closest debate. Let's welcome the governor reply.
In contrast to the reply speaker, I don't have 10 things to talk about, I only have 3. But these are the 3 focal points of this debate. The first one, what's good for China? The second, what's best for the international community? And finally, does China have the right to do so? And this is something which they miss. Because we clearly characterize, even if the worst case scenario happens, that other countries suffer, China still has the right to do so and to maintain comparative advantage. First one, what's good for China? The assumption from that side was, hey, if we don't allow China to manipulate, it doesn't mean that it will hurt the Chinese economy, it's fine. But we need to recognize one thing. Both sides agree that the main engine, or the main economic engine of China is the manufacturing-based industry. And we give 2 analyses how that will be harmed. The first one is because of the increase in the cost of labor. And we need to recognize one thing. The increase in the cost of labor was not done by China. It was done by Western nations who based their companies in China, who demanded the Chinese government place really high standards on human rights. So we think that's why, ladies and gentlemen, it is necessary. Because if China doesn't do so, these companies will move to India because it will be significantly cheaper. That's something which they miss. But more importantly is the recent economic crisis and subprime mortgage crisis which happened. And remember one thing, these crises were not committed by China. China didn't cause this. It was primarily the fault of those individual nations. Therefore, the aggressor is not China. The aggressor is based on the mistakes committed by the countries who you would like to defend. So we think it is quite clear that Chinese manufacturing industry will be significantly harmed, ladies and gentlemen, if it is unable to maintain the sustainability in its exports. But more importantly, we also told you that this is important so that China can combat protectionist policies. And this is where it's a huge lie. Just kind of step in and say, no, other countries is merely temporary. Bullshit! Like New Deal 1 and New Deal 2 was extended until 1975. Recently, the automobile bailout package. In India, protectionist policies existed since decades. Don't lie, guys. You know that from India. The second thing, ladies and gentlemen, the next thing which you want to see, and this is important, is because China is currently being treated as an economic hostage by most Western companies. Because the Chinese economy is dependent on these private entities. Therefore, we think it's important for China to have a retaliatory measure to control their act, because we think this is an extension of self-defense, so we think we will clearly win that issue. But then they said, oh, what about pension funds? What about purchasing power of Chinese? This is where we told you consumerism would be better on our policy, because the money will circulate within the country, ladies and gentlemen, because the cost of products made by Chinese companies will be significantly cheaper, and that's something we should ignore. The characterization coming from my speech, why tourism will be better in China, why people choose to buy local products in contrast to expensive international products. So we win on that point as well. Now let's move on towards what's best for the international community. They say now there will be a race to the bottom. Why Mubarak told you that there's a disincentive to do so because inflation will occur, you only had response in reply. You didn't have the response in win, so we think that's unfair there. But secondly, I told you in my speech, this will happen because other countries like the United States are not manufacturing heavy. They have an alternative, which is service-based industry. But China doesn't have that luxury. The Chinese economy is dependent on its manufacturing industry. That's why it needs that, ladies and gentlemen, in contrast to other countries who you would like to protect. So we think we will win on that point as well. But we need to recognize one thing. They said, then we also told you about the point of reciprocity. They said, oh, reciprocity doesn't matter because Chinese will gain something from it. It doesn't matter, right? But the point is, Chinese companies and the Chinese government was the one who initiated economic growth in these nations. It was because of them. The toxic tax which they bought, the Federal Reserve which invested in. And this is something which China did to stabilize the economy of the world. Therefore, reciprocity should also exist. But finally, this is where we clearly won this debate. We tell you, even in the worst case scenario, we think it's still necessary, it's still justified for China to do this because they have the right to do so if it means helping the people on the ground, even if it means sacrificing other nations. Sadly enough, we are individual nations, we have our own individual interests, we think that's necessary, we think that's fine.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Go, Yuki.
Mr. Speaker, we recognise the fact that the criteria that we're using is very ambiguous, the words united and non-united. So we're going to set out as clearly as possible. We're going to make a case-by-case analysis. So, for example, in case of Syria, when the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Council got together recently, we think that we can call that as being a united army. Even though there is one small sector that may be different or have different branches, we think that in general we can call that a big united party. But against, for example, against the awakening movement post and during the war in Iran, where we only funded the Shias, and then we had the conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis later on post, and that went on to create a big division. I think that's something that we can call that's not united, that's ununited. And we think that that's the case, that's the criteria that we would like to be using. We think that the criteria should be where there is a big clear wedge or a big clear division that exists between the two parties, and that's what we want to stand for. The support that we're talking about is everything. Recognition, military support, funding, all the kinds of support are things that we believe that the international community should not go about supporting. Now, until we have a recognized, a united opposition, we think we should abstain from doing so. So the first argument I'm going to bring to you today is how by supporting the ununited opposition is going to go about exacerbating the problem, going to create even a civil war. So the first reason we need to talk about is that we're going to go about creating a situation, we're going to pitch one opposition against another opposition. We need to recognize the fact that because we go about funding different types of oppositions, which are, even though they may have a common goal and a common enemy of toppling one leader, their objectives of doing so and their want of doing so and their vision of the society after the toppling of the leader is very, very different. In that instance, when we go about funding each and every opposition, giving them more weapons, giving them more ammunition, giving them more money to work with, I think it's going to create a situation where even after they take down, it's going to create a situation post-conflict which my partner will go about enhancing, but moreover, even during the process of settling down, they're going to see each other as being an enemy also, because they see them as being someone they need to take out in the long-term future, so they think that it will be irrational for them to calculate as something they should do so in the process as well. Secondly, we think it's also going to go about empowering the dictator's rhetoric. when we see this clear division happening between each and every opposition group, the dictator can simply say, look at the groups that are fighting against us. They're all divided, they don't know what they want, they don't know what their goals are, they're not even united. Compared to the dictator, who can offer stability, who can offer a clear aim, vision, and a goal. But then in that situation, the rhetoric of the dictator that they can use to influence the people is going to be far more stronger, far more superior in comparison to when we don't have conflict happening between the opposition groups. Thirdly, we need to recognise the fact that it's going to weaken the opposition hold on specific regions. The fact is, these opposition groups are going to be able to hold a certain region when they take over it, if they have the money, if they have the capacity, if they have the capability. But the fact is, we're only going to be funding under that paradigm or under the status quo certain groups. We're not funding every kind of group. In that instance, we need to recognise the fact that there is going to be a disparity happening between the groups, between the power that each and every group has. In that instance, we need to recognise the fact that there are going to be areas which are more lightweight than other areas, which is going to make it easier for the dictator to come up and take over and regain that area. We think that's going to be harmful for the goal at the end of the day to go about taking or toppling the dictator down. We also need to recognise the fact that we're going to probably see an increase of support from devious undemocratic governments or support groups or any other things that exist, such as Hamas and so on, those kind of things, who are not going to be accountable for the funding that they do, who are not going to be accountable for the weapons that they give them, who are not going to be held properly accountable to the support that they do. We think that's something in comparison to the international community, and when this is in cases such as the UN and so on, help is something far more worse as a larger plan. We also need to recognise the fact that it's going to make it easier to have the people align with the dictators themselves. There are going to be situations where the people are not going to have the weapons compared to the other dictators and so on, and we think that it's going to cause a situation where only one opposition group has that power, when only one opposition group has a bigger power than another opposition group that exists in society. As in the case in Afghanistan, where we only funded the Northern Alliance, the other tribes decided to join the Taliban as well. We think that current situation is also going to happen when we only go about funding one group, and that's something we see as being harmful. Yes, sir.
The harms that are coming from your proposal is based on the assumption that we're going to pick one particular party and fund them. Would you be okay if we fund everyone to balance the symmetry of power?
The fact is, if we go about funding each and every group, as I said, there is a clear division between the groups that exist. When there is a clear division that exists amongst the groups, and when they have different visions, different goals for the future, it's only going to give them more weapons to fight against each other with. That's going to cause even more conflict, even more death, so that's something we have a problem with as well. We also need to recognise the fact that the weapons that we're funding, that the weapons that we're sending, that the money that we're sending is being used as a fight against the innocent on the ground as well. It's not only being used against the dictator which the whole group wants to topple, but we recognise the fact that these opposition all have different incentives and different objectives, and an incentive to take each other out as well. We need to recognise the fact that these weapons are being used for taking out the innocent civilians that want a new life afterwards. We think that is the same or akin to the West sanctioning murder, and that's something that our side of the house does not want to stand for. We need to recognise also that once the people are divided, they are put in a situation where they have to choose which opposition group to align themselves with, who they are most closest with. We think that creates a situation where these people become more apathetic, don't know what to support. We think it's going to become even harder for the opposition groups to gather support and gather movement and movement. So for all these reasons, we think if we are going to fund or support opposition to dictators, we believe that they need to be united. Thank you.